and welcome. My name is Kurt Volker. I'm the Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership, which is part of Arizona State University. And we are delighted to be working in partnership with Jiri Luik and the ICDS, the Lennart Meri Conference, the Rina Kaljuran. Thank you all very much for having us here. And the McCain Institute, I should just tell you very quickly, it is named to honor the legacy of leadership and service to the United States of Senator McCain, Mrs. McCain, and the McCain family going back generations. It's a part of a public university. It's by definition nonpartisan. We have a bipartisan board of trustees. We fashion ourselves as a do tank rather than a think tank. We try to take on projects in the areas of promoting character-driven leadership, of carrying out humanitarian work, promoting human rights, promoting national security, and global rule of law and governance. Those are the areas that we work in. One of the things that we do as well is we try to foster a culture of debate about the choices that the United States and the world face, given the challenges that are before us. We've done a series of debates, everything from should we intervene in Syria to whether we should get out of Afghanistan, in a new US-Cuba policy, did Cuba win? We try to make our debates nonpartisan, and by doing that, we put people from the left and right on both sides of a question in order to stimulate talking about the substance itself and not having it go into a partisan back and forth. For tonight's debate, we're doing exactly the opposite, because the question that we are putting forward is what is going to be better for the United States and the world, a Democrat-led foreign policy or a Republican-led foreign policy after the next election in the United States. And that requires a partisan setup, if you will, in order to debate that question. When we chose this topic, it seemed like a sensible question to ask. Would there be a Democrat or Republican foreign policy, and then which would be better? I feel very bad for our two Republican debaters here in the situation of actually having to explain what they think and what they think might happen, and they may not be the same thing. In order to take on this debate, we've chosen some people who've been involved with the political process and foreign policy for some time. I'm going to start at the far end here, an old friend and colleague known to all of you, Ian Brzezinski. Ian was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee going back to the Jesse Helms days. He was the expert for Europe and Eurasia. He and I worked together on NATO enlargement issues. We worked again together when he was in the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He spent 5 years at Booz Allen. He runs his own consulting firm now as a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. And Ian was involved in working with the Jeb Bush campaign early on, and then also more recently with Marco Rubio's campaign until Marco Rubio pulled out. Next to Ian, also a former Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer, is Dan Vajdich, also affiliated with the Atlantic Council, and also having his own boutique consulting firm in Washington.
I want to be like this guy.
And Dan had been a senior foreign policy advisor to Governor Scott Walker at the onset of his presidential campaign, and then most recently has been working with Senator Cruz as he was the last standing candidate against Donald Trump in the primary elections in the US. Next to Dan, another old friend and colleague and known to many, many of you is Sally Painter. Sally is a member of the board of the U.S. Committee on NATO, which for those of us who worked on those early days of NATO enlargement, it was a vital transatlantic support group that helped bring about a policy decision in favor of NATO enlargement, congressional ratification of NATO enlargement, and consensus within Europe around NATO enlargement. Sally played a huge role in that. Sally now is a co-founder and chief operating officer of Blue Star Strategies and is working with the Hillary Clinton campaign. And next to Sally, we have Leigh O'Neill. Leigh is the managing director for policy and legislative affairs with the Truman National Security Project, also involved with the Hillary Clinton campaign, and also a former Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer, and also having worked for John Kerry, now Secretary of State, but then Senator from Massachusetts. So those are our teams here. In order to tee this up, I want to explain a little bit how we do these debates as a McCain Institute, which I hope works for all of you with the Lennart Meri Conference. We try to make it a formal, structured, timed debate. We want equal time for each side. We want an opportunity for back and forth. We encourage debaters to have back and forth among themselves. Part of my job as the moderator is to keep it organized and moving. We offer the first team 4 minutes to introduce their case as to why they believe that their side would present the best foreign policy for the U.S. and the world. Given the circumstances, that's going to be Sally and Leigh going first in order to explain what they see as Hillary Clinton's approach and what would be her foreign policy and why that is the best thing we could hope for. We'll then give 4 minutes to Ian and Dan to present their case, 2 minutes to each side to rebut that, and then we open up for questions. As moderator, I'll lead off with a few questions and try to cover a few topics, but I have a feeling that there is a high degree of interest in this topic in the audience, and we're going to try to get to audience questions early, and we will make sure to turn them to each side, and we'll give each side 2 minutes to respond to audience questions. At the end of the debate, as we start to wrap up, we will do a 1-minute lightning round, which is basically for each individual in 1 minute or less to say what their top recommendation is for what the next U.S. president should do upon taking office. So we will come to that at the end. To start off, I'm going to turn it over to Sally and Leigh.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Volker, and on behalf of myself and Sally, thanks to the Lennart Meri conference organizers, and of course the McCain Institute for welcoming us both here today. We definitely look forward to this debate, and especially the thoughts of our distinguished colleagues on the Republican side for their thoughts as well. The 21st century is marked by blurring borders, contested spaces, fragile and failing states, the proliferation of dangerous technologies, increasingly capable non-state actors and proxy forces, and the aspirations of resurgent and rising states. Some states seek to remake the international order in their image and to their exclusive benefit. Meanwhile, indiscriminate transnational phenomena like pandemic disease and climate change challenge even the strongest countries and further weaken those that are most vulnerable. U.S. foreign policy to address these challenges will be most effective under a Democratic president. Why? Because the Democratic Party fields candidates that govern based on a strong, forward-looking, liberal internationalist worldview. Guided by this worldview, Democrats have demonstrated that effective American leadership in the 21st century requires us to employ every tool of global engagement to seize opportunities for progress and resolve complex challenges. This means America leverages its defense, diplomatic, development, and democratic engagement tools to lead towards a safer, more prosperous world. The most literal source of American power is, of course, the might of our defense, and our military plays an indispensable daily role in maintaining global stability. Together with our allies, our defense and intelligence communities have the strength and agility to deter conflict and quickly and decisively defeat any adversary when conflict is unavoidable. This will continue to be so. But we must never forget that the large-scale use of military force comes with profound costs and should always remain a matter of last resort. Which is why we are strongest, of course, when we work consistently and in good faith with our allies and partners. This requires continued investment in strong security, diplomatic, and economic alliances and engagement with our allies, as well as sometimes with our adversaries. Our interests may at times require ad hoc coalitions or even unilateral action. But fundamentally, America cannot solve today's transnational threats without the sustained cooperation of nations that share our values and understand that we face common challenges together. When America strays from this path, whether by withdrawing from responsible global leadership, ignoring global threats, or unilaterally imposing our will through force, we and others have suffered. The current Democratic president, President Obama, and the future Democratic president have an intimate understanding of our world today and how it is very different from that of our predecessors. To be clear, the next Democratic president will be our former First Lady, former U.S. Senator, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who has been consistently throughout the election by far the most qualified candidate in the field to ensure security and prosperity in this time of new global challenges. U.S. foreign policy under a President Hillary Clinton will exemplify the principled international approach needed as we rethink old paradigms of power, develop integrated approaches, build and renew new partnerships, and modernize the global security institutions that have made the past 70 years of American global leadership some of the most peaceful and prosperous in human history. Thank you.
Thank you, Leigh. Turning to Ian and Dan. On the one hand, sounds like there's nothing in there to argue with. On the other hand, Leigh's making the case for a Democratic president, and I wonder first, maybe, is that we've had a Democratic president for the last 8 years? Does that describe what we've seen? But more particularly, what would you see as necessary from a Republican perspective in foreign policy going forward?
I think what I'll do is I'll explain to you why I've been committed to Republican foreign policy over the last 20 years and why I'm concerned about the current nominee. And then we can go on and debate whether or not the alternatives are that we really are going to be that satisfied with the Clinton presidency. I said I spent 20 years in the Senate as a staffer and supporting about a dozen presidential candidates in one way or the other. And if you do 20 years and a dozen candidates, you do the math on that. But I've been attracted to GOP national security policy, be it Bob Dole's, McCain's, Romney's, the Bush's, because they have all reflected recognition that robust international engagement is critical to the promotion and protection of U.S. interests. They also bring to the table foreign policy vision. It's just not a transactional approach to international affairs. They're driven by a vision to promote peace, prosperity, human rights. They've all recognized that a successful foreign policy, of course, rests upon a strong economy, a robust military capability, but also a very healthy set of alliances and partnerships. And they've all worked to generate and sustain those partnerships. In the transatlantic arena, our area where we are today, that's translated into Republican policy that has called for assertive American leadership in the alliance, not leading from behind, not a passive approach. It means driving forward NATO enlargement, encouraging EU enlargement. It means embracing the transatlantic ambitions of countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. When you go to Trump's foreign policy, when I go out and I read his speech, his interviews, his tweets, all I can find is essentially a geopolitically incoherent worldview, perhaps characterized by a heavy dose of jingoism. It reflects an isolationist impulse, a disregard and lack of appreciation for alliances and partnerships, a fire-and-forget approach to the use of military force, a lack of concern for human rights in the Geneva Convention, and a heavy protectionist outlook. When I look at this election, what I see is not an emerging debate over or decision or competition over policy, but over personality. Trump could win. I'm not as confident as my colleague that Hillary Clinton's got this in the bag. But I am also concerned that because Trump right now is the nominee, the presumptive nominee, he is going to have an impact on the American electorate's outlook on foreign policy.
Dan?
Well, I obviously agree with everything Ian said. And, you know, from my perspective in terms of what a traditional or good Republican administration would do next is it would move quickly to restore American credibility around the world and to fix the ruptured relationships that we have with our allies throughout the world. What this basically means is the United States needs to, after 8 years of Obama, demonstrate in each and every part of the world that we are ready to reassume a leadership role and that we're going to be ready to act if needed. So in Europe, for example, I think that would have to be done with respect to two issues, Ukraine and the migrant crisis. In Ukraine, I think a good traditional Republican administration would move to provide not necessarily decisive, but some level of lethal military assistance to Ukraine. This would indicate to Vladimir Putin that we have and we will continue to move past a certain threshold unless he begins to implement the Minsk agreement.
Oh, we'll have to come back to refugees.
Okay.
So
And other regions of the world.
yeah, and other regions. We'll have plenty of time. But I want to come back now to Sally and to Leigh. Part of what Dan was just saying is an assertion that there hasn't been U.S. leadership. The U.S. has pulled back. We need to reestablish U.S. credibility. Is that how you see where we're starting out in a new administration?
Let me take this one. Both Daniel's and Ian's view on policy, I think, is very interesting, and I might not disagree with most of it, but that's not what you have. What we have is a candidate that doesn't embody any of the traditional values of the Republican Party, and we really are struggling to find out how will he be influenced? Who will influence him? How do we make it so this guy does not take us off to the abyss? And the people like yourselves who are already distancing themselves, I think it's admirable because it's a responsible thing to do as an American. But this is risky. This is the presidency of the United States. And I think it incumbent on all of us to look at how do we make this risk less? And now we have a candidate in the Democratic Party who has, as Leigh said, the most experience of any candidate ever running. And she just happens to be a woman. And we know her policies. We know her track record. She's clearly the better option because at this stage in our history, we cannot afford to tackle those kinds of risks. And frankly, I think, this is a failure of the Republican Party. You all have very strong policy initiatives, and they're not anywhere on this candidate's plate. So I guess my question to you all is, how does the Republican Party deal with this? How do we get us out of this terrible box of basically a policy crisis of a guy who could truly destroy our credibility?
Ian, Dan, over to you. I mean, I think you're going to...
Let me start out by just wrapping up what I was saying earlier about what a traditional Republican foreign policy looked like. I mean, at its core, traditional Republican foreign policy believes that American prosperity and security is founded on the liberal international order that we helped construct and that together with our friends and allies we maintain. Obviously, this diverges from Donald Trump's perspective. In fact, you often hear this idea that and it's not altogether unreasonable, but the notion that Donald Trump doesn't have a worldview. That's something I actually disagree with, and I am no fan of Donald Trump, but the man has a worldview, as terrible as it is. What it boils down to is that he believes that the maintenance of the international order, that what the United States invests in maintaining the international order, that's a bad deal. That what we invest is not commensurate to what we get out of it. And so he thinks it's a bad deal. And that means that he believes that free trade benefits others, not us. He believes that the military expenditures that we spend on various alliances and countries around the world to support their security benefits them and not us. But the man, I would say, is not an isolationist. He's not an isolationist. He's definitely not an idealistic pacifist. He's a guy who actually, I think, if a situation were to meet the criteria that he has, I think he would use military force and he would perhaps overuse it. I mean, he would use it overwhelmingly. So he's not an isolationist. He's not a pacifist. I would call him a power isolationist, which seems like a little bit of an oxymoron and a self-contradiction, which it is. But guess what? Donald Trump is a little bit of an oxymoron and a self-contradiction in terms of everything that he says. So I think the term's appropriate. And there's no doubt that what Donald Trump has been saying and the ideas that underpin his worldview are alien to Republican foreign policy.
Okay, so we're going to stick on Trump for a little bit, and then we're going to dismiss it. Okay.
Okay.
But I think we need to just clarify. First off, I just want to put out for the audience, and I don't think anyone on the stage would disagree with me. Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee, and he will therefore be Hillary Clinton's opponent in the general election. And the Republican Party apparatus and leadership, for the most part, will rally around Trump as a political candidate for the Republican Party. So the first question, and it's really, I'll give you a little more time on this too. Maybe we'll go to 3 minutes. But what is the scenario you imagine playing out when it comes to him being the candidate of the Republican Party and his views on foreign policy going forward from there.
Okay. Being an optimist, I would have to turn to say there's one thing that's positive about Trump's worldview as we know it. It appears to be highly malleable. So maybe there's hope there. What I would imagine is that you will probably see, and you're already seeing it now, first the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee falling behind him, and they're doing that. The next level will be, I think, members of Congress who will start falling behind him, and you're already seeing that. Yeah, he's already got Sessions and other members of Congress in one level of lukewarmness and slight warmness in endorsing him. As that crowd grows, you'll have enough political momentum where then all of a sudden they'll be more able to effectively reach out to quote-unquote establishment foreign policy types who will start bleeding into his campaign. And there's the possibility that maybe some of the themes that Dan and I talked about can be kind of shoved into his emergent platform and his emergent worldview. And that hopefully could be something that's more or less continuous with some of the foreign policies that previous Republican candidates and previous Republican administrations have brought. So perhaps a recognition that the alliance is important. And let's note that, you know, in his, he heard something after he rolled out that NATO was obsolete, that he's made his first recommendation in his first foreign policy speech. He said, when I get elected, one of the first things I want to do is have a NATO summit. I'm reaching, I'm hopeful, but at least it reflects he's willing to commit some of his time to an alliance that he said previously was obsolete. It'll take time. We'll have to cross our fingers for a long time. But if he's malleable, then there's a theoretical option for change.
All right. All right. So we'll put it there. And that was actually pretty efficient. It was under 2 minutes. Sally?
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Because, you know, we have two candidates. One is a tried and true candidate who has more experience than ever, has a commitment to the transatlantic relationship, is 100% behind NATO, is a person who has demonstrated on every issue, if you look at her campaign, she's thought this stuff through. And frankly, it's irresponsible, I believe, to go behind a candidate that you know is so dangerous that tomorrow he may say we are going to invade a country. We are Americans. This isn't even about partisanship anymore. This guy is crazy. Let me just, in your party's own words, there was a letter that some of the most impressive and important national security people wrote a letter open to Trump. And I'll just paraphrase a couple of these things. We are united in opposition to Trump because his vision of America is widely inconsistent and unmoored in principle. He swings from isolationism to military adventurism within a sentence. His advocacy for aggressively waging against trade laws is a recipe for economic disaster. His embrace of torture is inexcusable. His acceptance of Putin and admiration of Putin is unacceptable. How can anybody with your experience, which is great and I respect, think that this is a person when on the other side you have somebody who's incredibly reasonable and time-tested?
Okay, do you mind?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say for the record, I signed that letter.
Here's where I am on that. This guy is a leader of one of the major parties in the United States. And if there's an opportunity to give him good advice, you should give him good advice, including Democrats if he reaches out. Now, with that said, it's very easy to take Hillary Clinton and juxtapose her against Trump. But let me tell you, I have some concerns about the Democratic platform or the experience she brings. Who led the last reset? Hillary Clinton. Who was part of the administration and made no opposition to the second to the last major reposturing of the U.S. military forces globally? Who led to the withdrawal? Who contributed to the withdrawal of U.S. combat brigades from Europe? Who was part of the administration has done nothing on NATO enlargement? Who was part of an administration that inherited a rough situation in Iraq and Afghanistan and is about to hand it over a much more complicated, if not worse, situation it was members of the Democratic Party, including Hillary Clinton. So, you know, my point is that Trump may not be great, but take a hard look at your own candidate.
Yeah, we're going to take this back to you guys now.
Can I
And
just rebut this one?
yeah,
So-
but let's take a few of these piecemeal now. Let's start on Russia, because that's a topic of great interest to everybody here. How would the new U.S. administration deal with Russia? And Ian does have a point. Is Linus still here, or did he have to go already? Linus was still at NATO. Maybe Yuri, you were there still too when Hillary Clinton had her first NATO ministerial meeting, and we reset the NATO Russia Council. We had suspended it after the war in Georgia. We resumed it as a result of this meeting in February of 2009 with Hillary Clinton. That was a fine discussion. We had an agreed, balanced approach at NATO. We were expecting things from Russia. They had to do things. We would do things. And the result of that could be the resumption of the NATO-Russia Council. But on the very same trip, she then went to Geneva and then did the big red overload button with Lavrov, which came as a surprise to everybody who had been at the NATO meeting. Now, this was not part of the discussion. So there is a basis to what Ian's saying is, how is she going to come out on Russia? And when you think about it, too, some of the other crises that the Obama administration had to deal with, such as Syria, such as Ukraine, such as the continuation of Russia's occupation of parts of Georgia, there had been a priority through the reset on the relationship with Russia instead of confronting these issues at the time. And as we've seen, that has emboldened Putin, and we have more of a confrontation or more problems now. So give me that case then. How is she going to be better than the Obama administration was when she was Secretary of State?
Well, I think we should first look at some other language of George W. Bush, who looked into his eyes and saw his soul. And everybody said, really? And he felt that he was going to have a more robust and good relationship with Putin. As I recall, Putin invaded Georgia under the Bush policy. So I think from that perspective, you cannot tag the reset on the Obama administration. Secondly, it wasn't just a little fracas. When the president and the first secretary went in, it was 8 years of frayed relationships. There were 2 major wars, and the economy was about to collapse. So there was a lot going on at that point. I think still, as a foreign minister, she was very much engaged in transatlantic relations, even though she was supposed to pivot to Asia. I also think that we're going to look back in history with our relationship with Russia, and we're going to go to 2008 in the Bucharest summit, again under Bush's watch. 2008, when the alliance failed to give MAP to Ukraine and Georgia, in June of 2008, 3 months later,
April.
Georgia was invaded. Nothing happened. What was the lesson for Putin? I think you're going to find a Secretary Clinton, a President Clinton with a more muscular, robust policy, more forward-thinking than President Obama, and it's because she's got a lot of history here. This is a woman who spent time in all of your countries. She knows you, and she believes in the transatlantic relationship, and she knows that if there's any problem that we have on the globe, if we're working together as allies in our transatlantic partnership, we can win it. And I think we are even putting Russia with Syria in that case. But please, the expert on that.
Okay, let me ask you to keep going for a second, though, because what would a Hillary Clinton presidency do on Russia and the issues that we're talking about at this conference? So, for example, arming Ukraine, Minsk agreement, talks in Geneva about the occupied territories and pushing them back, both Ukraine and Georgia, increased U.S. military deployments in Europe, missile defense. Where does she come out on these issues?
Do you want to take some of that?
Are you trying to make news at this conference? I'm not an official spokesperson for the Hillary Clinton campaign, nor will I pretend to be. I defer entirely to the others on the stage if they want to take that one.
So we're talking about policy and where the secretary has been. She was very supportive of missile defense. She's 100% behind NATO. She's supportive of a strong allied response to Ukraine, keeping sanctions. I think that when you look at the policies she's led, and I think that everybody in this room is going to be much more comforted there. And I think they all want some comfort. So I'd like to give you a statistic that might make you feel better, even our Republican colleagues. There have been 41 Republican primaries that have taken place in our country. In 34 of those primaries, more Republicans have voted against Donald Trump than have voted for him. So we've got 34 against. In our country, with the next election, there will only be 7 to 12 states that make a difference, eventually, because of the Electoral College. He has received only 1 support, and that's in Pennsylvania. So I think the cooler heads will prevail, and this view that the press has given us that, you know, the whole country is behind this person is false. He has not had nearly the votes that people have said. More have voted against him.
Okay. We're going to give a chance to Ian and Dan now. I forgot to say at the outset, for those of you who are tweeting, please feel free to include @McCain Institute in your tweets as well. And turn to you guys. So Sally makes a pretty compelling case of, even though maybe not the greatest level of detail, but Hillary Clinton standing on some core points about the alliance, about Ukraine, about U.S. troops. So in Vilnius, as we speak, there's a restaurant now with a mural on the side of it with Trump and Putin kissing, just like the old Brezhnev-Honecker one. So that's certainly the image that Trump likes the strongman Putin and might be cutting deals in this part of, or about this part of the world. So there's 2 questions here. One of them is, I know no one on this stage is supporting Donald Trump, and so I'm not asking you to defend what he's saying. I am asking, is that a legitimate worry, and can it be dealt with? This, if Trump were to become president, this prioritization of Putin over others. And then secondly, getting back to what Sally was saying about Hillary, is that a persuasive statement to you that we can be confident that she's going to handle these issues right this time?
Well, going to your first question about Trump and Russia, look, if you strip, I know this is going to be a little controversial, but let's think through this for a second. If you strip away the bluster and the rhetoric and the demeanor, what you get in terms of Trump's worldview and his Russia policy, I think, is a slightly more extreme version of the reset. Essentially, what he's saying is, I'm going to cut deals with Vladimir Putin, I'm going to cut deals with Russia, and I can do this because I'm a great negotiator. And you know, we tried that under the Obama administration, and I would argue that the consequences were pretty dire. I would say, not only did we prioritize Russia at the expense of our allies in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, but it also created a permissive environment for Ukraine. He got no pushback. Concessions were thrown unilaterally, left and right, and Vladimir Putin logically, reasonably, rationally came to the conclusion that he could do what he did in Crimea and Ukraine. And so it is a little bit scary that Donald Trump's Russia policy sounds a lot like President Obama's Russia policy. And of course, Hillary Clinton was a huge part of that. Is she going to be a little tougher on Russia? Yeah, I think she's going to do her best to make up for her transgressions and her mistakes in the context of the reset. But I would say that, you know, as far as the results and the consequences of the reset are concerned, including Ukraine, there's no making up for those mistakes because the effects have already taken place.
Ian, did you want to add anything to this?
I guess I don't think I'd add is that, you know, with George Bush's reset, he learned in 2007, 2008. He actually sent in military forces to Georgia, not combat forces, but he sent a U.S. combat plane. That's what stopped Putin in his tracks and let Putin sit back for a couple of years and say, I need to reboot my military. What's stunning to me about the last the Obama administration, including Secretary of State Clinton, is they didn't learn from the mistake. They undertook another reset. That, to me, is not learning from the past.
Okay, I'm going to switch topics now. Let's come to the Middle East and terrorism. And I'll put you guys up front. how is a Republican foreign policy, and again, not asking you to defend Trump, but extrapolate what can happen here. You will have, we have now a war in Syria. We have ISIS. We have a failed state in Libya. We have a growing Sunni Shia conflict. We have an emboldened Iran, which has a 10-year clock running now for a nuclear weapon. How to tackle all of these things? What do you think we should be doing? And what do you think we will end up doing? Here is where, if there's any set of issues, maybe some of this tough talk by Trump and really about protecting might be a smart policy. What do you think?
Well, on ISIS, I think, you know, what a traditional Republican administration would do and what the next president of the United States needs to do is clearly demonstrate early on a greater commitment to defeat ISIS using air power and some sort of presence on the ground beyond what we have there now. And I think if that were to happen, the regional actors, including Russia, would fall into line. The Iran deal, I think, I worked for two candidates, Scott Walker and Ted Cruz, both of whom said that they would repeal the Iran deal on day one. I genuinely believe that they would have. It would have been gradual and responsible. And I think those are the two key words. A Republican administration, setting aside Donald Trump, but a traditional Republican administration would gradually and responsibly repeal the Iran deal, asking Iran at each stage, okay, are you willing to give us more concessions on enrichment or on centrifuges or in another area? And if not, I mean, we would gradually ramp up the sanctions back to the point where they were in July of 2015 before the deal was signed, and probably go beyond that if need be. So, you know, the Iran deal, I think, is just is illustrative of how the administration handles this administration, and Hillary Clinton was clearly a part of it. How they manage alliances and allies. I mean, this was something that was signed over the heads of our friends and allies, and you wouldn't see that in a Republican administration. You definitely wouldn't. With respect to Trump, just briefly, it's actually I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. I don't adhere to his worldview, but it's very difficult to say on ISIS in particular who would be more effective. I think Hillary Clinton, I think she does want to be assertive, but let's not discount the fact and the reality that sometimes gets blurred by the rise of Donald Trump, and that is the rise of Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders is still winning states, even though I'm told he doesn't have a chance. You know, and it has moved Hillary Clinton to the left on foreign policy. I mean, she rejected TPP, something that she, you know, heralded for years. So you know, she's going to be constrained internally by party politics in the Democrat Party. Whereas Donald Trump, I think, being the power isolationist that he is, I think that Syria does meet his criteria for using military force, at least, you know, air power, pretty liberally. So I'm not quite sure who would be more effective with respect to ISIS, and with respect to the Iran deal. Also, I think that there's a lot of ambiguity about what Donald Trump would do there and how committed Hillary Clinton is to that.
So turning it to you guys to respond to that, and in particular, we could all say, well, we don't think Trump's got the solution. Dan did give some specifics on what needs to happen in terms of ramping up the fight against ISIS in a much more aggressive and serious way, in terms of redoing the Iran deal. What do you see on this?
So just a point of language, it is, when we talk about the Democratic Party, it is the Democratic Party. I'm not quite sure where the Democrat Party came from, but on the Republican side, traditional Republican foreign policy ends up in one of two ways. It ends up with air power or an increased troop presence on the ground, every single time. So when you're listening to the solutions put forward, all you have to do is listen carefully and then rinse and repeat, look back on history. We are looking for a different set of applications of the vast amount of tools we have in our toolkit that leverage all of the assets of American power. And that should start with robust diplomacy with our allies until that has failed. On the Iran deal specifically, that did not fail. It was a success. if you evaluate it based on what the goals were. And the goals were to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. We did not sign that deal over the head of our friends and allies. Not at all. We worked in partnership for years with our friends and allies across the world, and specifically here in Europe. Just much like we did with the agreement in the climate agreement in China, et cetera, with Sikkim and the counter-ISIL coalition, and so it goes. I mean, these are massive coalitions that are under American leadership to advance these shared goals. On Iran specifically, the point of the nuclear negotiations were to cut off Iran's access and paths to a bomb, and it achieved that. Iran has reduced its stockpile of enriched uranium, it has disabled its centrifuges, and it has irreparably shut down its plutonium reactor. It has also, under the most extensive inspections regime ever in the history of nonproliferation, we are watching their supply chain from landmines to laboratories. That will continue. All of that is to say that nothing in the deal removed any of our other tools, punitive or otherwise, for countering the misbehavior of Tehran, period. And by the way, Congress never has, there's never really any pushback when Congress wants to punish Iran. Sanctions, increased sanctions can happen in a bill and legislation overnight in a bipartisan fashion. So that is very much on the table. So human rights sanctions against human rights violations and other terrorist support across the region and the world, we still have those sanctions in effect, and we are countering Iran outside of the nuclear portfolio, period. Mm-hmm. The Iran deal was a success.
New topic, Afghanistan. Afghanistan is teetering right now. We've got a very low level of international troops there, including US troops. There have been a significant regain of territory by the Taliban, and we have consistent reports of ISIS presence in Afghanistan as well. What do we do about that?
Honestly, I don't know. I really don't know, because it's not the first time we've seen this. We've been in and out of Afghanistan in one way or another for 2 generations now. And it doesn't seem like there is a clear solution for the future of that country. And to be very honest, these questions of broken states where bad actors come in and take advantage of state fragility, weak governance, et cetera, it seems like Afghanistan is the most extreme case. The best I can offer there is to continue some level of presence, a true presence there, with our international partners. As long as our international partners are committed to it as well, I think we should lead that. We owe it to our own service members for sure. But it also requires high-level diplomacy in the region, not just with Pakistan, but and on Pakistan, but certainly with India. And we need to assist the Afghan people and the government to create a vision or implement a vision for the future of a state that is representative of them and their needs, both on the social level, economic level, and that actually reflects the self-determination of the Afghan people.
It's a hard one. Do you have a better answer, Ian?
I guess maybe a little more, hopefully a more clear answer. The solution to Afghanistan, the solution to Iraq, and the solution to Syria, in my view, is going to require a comprehensive approach, which means it's going to have a diplomatic side, it's going to have a developmental side, and it's going to have a security side. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get the development and the political reform unless you have security. And we've seen in all 3 of those, or 2 of those contingencies, what happens when we prematurely reduce our security presence. All the progress that had been made was destroyed, and we're in a worse off situation. Now, my sense is that while there's a spectrum in both parties, you're more likely to get from a Republican candidate a commitment to the security side that's necessary. The force level presence that are necessary. The ground forces are going to be necessary. We're not going to solve Syria and bring development to Afghanistan from the sky, dropping lead. This will require some sort of ground presence to provide the training, the reinforcement of national security forces so they can provide that context necessary for positive political and economic growth. And what we've seen in the last administration is the costs of prematurely lowering that military presence. I disagree one point with Dan on Trump. Yeah, I think it's true that it may be a little bit unfair to say he's a pure isolationist, because he'll go jump out. He will use force. The problem is his approach to force is spasmodic. I'll go in, bomb, and leave. He's been highly critical of our operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Says we shouldn't be there. He would just go in and drop bombs and call it a day, which obviously is not going to be a sufficient solution to those very complex challenges.
Sounds like Syria.
Sounds like Syria.
One comment, Leigh said, she's not sure what we do in Afghanistan. I know what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't do what we did in Iraq, lest we suffer the same consequences there.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question,
So
and then I'm going to bring it to the audience.
The status of forces agreement was signed under the Bush administration for Iraq. I mean, let's just be honest about what this administration currently inherited from 8 years of President Bush. I mean, you cannot just have these conversations in a vacuum. There's context, important context, and this is a sophisticated room, a sophisticated audience, and many of you were there. So let's just recognize that.
Look, it's a counterfactual, but I believe that if President Bush were in the White House at the time, he would have moved to renegotiate the deal in good faith. I don't think that the Obama administration wanted that. Everyone knows, he knows that he was elected as someone who pledged to withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan. And he always had every intention of doing that, regardless of the circumstances on the ground. And that's part of why we have what we have now in Iraq and Syria.
Leigh?
We can debate hypotheticals all day long, but
Okay.
facts are the
Can I
facts.
just, maybe just to one point. Donald Trump could not sit in this room and understand half the things you just said.
Okay.
We have bipartisan agreement there.
We do.
Yeah, the difficulty here is that I think everybody agrees with Sally on that. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to come to the audience. I'm looking around. I see lots of hands, which is great. Ian and Dan, start with you. We're going to come to Sally and Leigh. What would you recommend the next administration do in dealing with China?
So I'll go first. So the next administration, I think, has to foster greater cooperation among our allies in Asia. People are going to say, no, we can't have an anti-China coalition. Fine, let's call it something else. But the hub and spoke system, I think at this stage, given the security environment, given China's assertiveness, I think we need to move beyond it, and I think the conditions are actually there for the first time in a very long time ever. So that's one. Two, conducting extremely assertive freedom of navigation patrols, preferably in conjunction with our allies, but if need be unilaterally, even at the risk of incidents with Chinese vessels.
I'll just add to that. I wouldn't use the word pivot to Asia. I would have a renewed emphasis on Asia, in which I would actually live up to what I inferred that I would do, beef up military presence and capabilities in the Pacific. So what we had in the last administration was a pivot that never really was a military pivot at all.
And anything on the non-military side that you want to mention?
Well, TPP, but Hillary Clinton has rejected that, unfortunately.
Leigh, Sally, recommendations for Asia and China?
I don't think that Secretary Clinton has rejected TPP. I don't think that that's true. No, she did. I don't think she rejected it. I think it is a yes and. She stands by there are clear structural incentives and credibility issues that are tied to this agreement. But the American people are hurting, and there are real effects to these trade deals at home. And so without meaningful trade adjustment assistance and real ways to mitigate the impact, frankly, of trade on the American worker, it's not a great scenario, and it can be improved. And I think that's what she was saying. I don't think it's fair to categorize that she walked away from that deal.
She didn't reject it. She merely suggested it the way Donald Trump suggests policy. Got it.
I don't know about that.
Okay, what about on the broader picture, though, of dealing with China?
So I actually I don't disagree with anything either of my colleagues just said. I mean, China is a reality, and one that we need to recognize and work with when we can on issues such as cybersecurity, when it makes sense to do that, like climate change, when it makes sense to do that, and find ways to push back and have a robust presence in the South China Sea for sure, show of force all the time, for sure, when that makes sense. But we cannot just disengage or go full throttle. It's far more nuanced than that. And we need to be able to work with them when possible. Our entire economic structure, frankly, relies on that.
Do you see a difference dealing with China and dealing with Russia? Do you see a difference in how the United States should be dealing with Russia and dealing with China?
Sure, it's case by case. I mean, history, our relationships are different, the personalities are different, the challenges are different. They rhyme, they mirror each other a little bit, but they're completely different countries.
Mm-hmm. Ian, Dan, same thing?
Every case is different, but I think it's important to have a certain amount of consistency in foreign policy. So your fundamental vision that guides you in Europe should also guide you in Asia Pacific. And if you allow them to differ too much, they will actually have friction between the two.
I would say that China has yet to get to the point where it is uprooting the international system and the principles that it's founded on, the way Russia is. But since we don't want China to get to that point, we need to push back, and we need to push back now.
Okay, we're going to take it to the audience. Do we have a microphone for Vajdich Sashaskas first? Here in the front row, can you bring the mic forward? That's good. We'll take another from the front row after, so give it to...
First of all, Kurt, thank you so much for such an entertaining session. I mean, the way where I come from Moscow, I would only wish that we would have that transmitted live Russia 24 in order to disillusion that there is no democracy and there is no debate in the West. Having said this, and having spent almost 6 years in the United States, I think what we're seeing are two candidates now, I mean, clearly emerged. One conventional, whom we know, Hillary Clinton, and very unconventional candidate. I had a privilege spending 6 years in the States and being twice as a guest of Donald Trump in Palm Beach. I don't think he's stupid. I don't think he's stupid. I think he's a very smart politician who has his own way to push forward. My question is, in that context, is indeed, I mean, especially since we have 4 Washington insiders in front of us, to what extent, if an unconventional candidate is elected, to what extent the check and balances of the Congress would work towards presidential policies and especially his appointments, because that's going to be a huge entertainment in terms of going through.
Thank you, Vajdich. So the question, will the checks and balances of the U.S. constitutional system be sufficient to rein in whatever Donald Trump might be if he wins? Ian and Dan, you want to take that first?
Sure, I can take a shot. I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, in terms of broad thrusts, let me answer this way. What do I think will happen if Trump becomes president under his current disposition? I think you're going to have absolute gridlock in Washington. He's going to have a tough time working with Congress, especially if his candidacy leads to loss of Republican majorities, or majority in at least one of the chambers. He's probably never going to really have a truly cooperative relationship with the Republican Party. He's very unlikely to have a very close cooperative relationship with the Democratic Party. So across Pennsylvania Avenue, if you think we have gridlock now, it would get much, much worse. I think you'd have gridlock also in the executive branch, because I'm not sure that he really brings the experience and disposition necessary to run something as complex as the U.S. national security bureaucracy, economic bureaucracy, and such. This is a guy who's basically going to run a small family-owned business. It's got billions of dollars, but it's basically run by a dozen people, half of them who are his family. That's not great experience to bring to the White House. If you think we had a transition problem with Obama, it's going to be magnified here. But remember, he's commander-in-chief. He would be a president who has got the same authorities that Obama has over our armed forces, over our diplomatic corps, over all the regulations that can tweak up and down our economy. So he'll have some impact.
Okay, and Sally and Leigh, same question.
I hope to God that if he were to be, that there would be that balance, because there is the power to do that. And that's what's great about our country. We have that checks and balances.
Yeah.
I mean, specifically, if he wants to fund a wall that runs across the Mexican border, for example, he would have to get that funded, and that would go through Congress, for example. If he wants to, right. So there's that. I mean, that's patently absurd. If he wants to undo longstanding international treaties, he would face Congress. I mean, and the list goes on and on. Basically, every single policy option that he's put forward would find its way either through the purse strings or through authorization of some sort being debated by Congress. That's for domestic and foreign policy, the way that he's cited that. And as far as appointments and things like that, you know, I hope that the next administration can have Congress approve their nominees. We need good people in government. We need our nominees to be confirmed. That is something that this Congress has failed to do in this administration. And I think actually President Obama is doing a fantastic job, considering that he's had his hands tied by the Republican Congress on that. It's not sexy stuff, but it's really important. And I hope that whatever the case, that appointees get confirmed next administration.
We should move on, but Dan, did you have a quick
Just
point?
a quick question. I mean, the kind of the conventional wisdom or the conventional murmurs in Washington are that if Trump becomes president, that the silver lining is going to be that Congress is going to be much more involved in foreign affairs and foreign policy. I think there's some truth to that, but we have this pesky thing called Article 1 of the Constitution, and it's going to be difficult for Congress to overcome that. As an institution, when I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I fought tooth and nail to pass a bill that granted $350 million in lethal military aid and assistance to Ukraine. And it was just an authorization, and that was difficult enough. So that's what I'm concerned about. I'm also concerned about what we see now, which is more and more senators, more and more congressmen bandwagoning with Trump. Obviously, if he were to overstep some of the general principles of U.S. foreign policy, that may change. But now I see, you know, folks like my old boss on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Corker, saying that Trump gave a substantive foreign policy speech, which isn't something I agree with. And so I am concerned that, you know, some of the more rational voices in Congress may not be so rational under a Trump presidency.
Okay, and we have so many hands in the audience. We're going to ask everyone to be really brief with questions, please. So, Mike Holtzel, you're next.
Okay. Real quickly, I congratulate all of you, especially the two Republicans, for your play acting. I think that's great. I disagree fundamentally, however, with the way everybody seems to have accepted the idea that relations with Russia have gone from bad to worse, and the reset is an unmitigated disaster, and that it somehow led to Ukraine. It's just factually false. Under the reset, we got the New START treaty passed with Republican votes. You couldn't get it passed through the Senate without it. We had the Northern Distribution Network that resupplied our troops in Afghanistan. And we had the nuclear deal with Iran, which incidentally we can't repeal because it's multilateral. And if we back out, the business people in France and Germany are just licking their chops to get in there.
Okay, so Sally or Leigh, do you want to defend the reset?
No, well, let me just say that the bloom was off the rose with the reset long before the Ukraine invasion. I mean, there is not a direct connection there. Let me just go on and say, with regard to relations with Russia, all day today, we've been hearing about how NATO has beefed up its policy, its presence and its deterrence in this area, in the Nordic Baltic. That's because of the Obama administration. You know, we're talking about almost $4 billion extra dollars that have been appropriated for it. That's a success. Ian and I know a little bit about NATO enlargement, and I'd remind you that Montenegro is about to join. You can make fun of Montenegro, but the point is the open door is still there. And I think it's a really good thing. And then finally, look, I side with Republican muscular foreign policy a lot. The only problem is, of the 5 candidates, I'll still say there are 5, Clinton's the only one whose economic policy wouldn't bankrupt the United States of America. The fact is, Trump's policy would put us into such debt that we wouldn't be able to afford to send a Piper Cub to the Middle East. So, I mean, talk is cheap. I understand. I have the same kind of emotions you do, but it's just not going to work. And one last thing on China, what not to do is a 45% tariff, which Trump seems to think would work.
Okay, can we have the mic down to Mike Murphy here? And then we'll pass it behind you for the next one.
Thank you. Mark Mullen from Transparency International. I wanted to ask about the Republican voter base. I could see you enjoyed talking about the traditional Republican foreign policy, but the foreign policy and the forward engagement of Hillary Clinton was of real concern to a lot of Bernie Sanders voters. But within the Democratic Party, there seems to be a pretty good understanding of what the foreign policy would be. That's obviously not the case with President Trump, but the things that are talked about at this conference are very different than what Republican voters, those that have supported Donald Trump, talk about in the United States. They're talking in 2004, it was gay marriage. Now it's about gendered bathroom use and gun control and things like that. There's not a lot of foreign policy discussion the way there is on the Democratic side. So what I'm wondering is, what does this say? The fact that more Republican voters have voted for Trump than any of the other candidates. What does this say about your base, and how is the Republican Party going to sell some of the ideas discussed at this conference to its voters in the future?
Okay, let me reframe that question, Mark, and I apologize for thinking Mike Murphy. I said that. But let me reframe that question, which is, we know Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. We know what he said about foreign policy. What is the pathway to getting the Republican electorate serious about the foreign policy challenges that we face?
I guess I'm going to try and answer both questions because I heard two different things. You know, one way to look at the Republican primary process and it's what it says about Republican foreign policy is to say you've got one guy who's got kind of a jingoistic, isolationist approach to foreign policy, who went up against, what is it? 16, of which most of the ones I looked at, even when he and I were competing on different campaigns, had fundamentally the same outlook, internationalist outlook, alliance appreciating outlook, free trade outlook. So that's one way of looking at it. The guy who has taken the nomination has a very different outlook, but I don't think he got the nomination because of his foreign policy. He won through a massive use of personality attacks. It became a personality battle, not a policy battle. So maybe that's good news. What's more concerning to me, however, is the context in which this primary took place, in which the Democratic primary is still taking place, is look at the recent polling that came out of Pew. If I have the number correct, I think it's 57% of Americans think we're over-engaged in the world. That, to me, is disconcerting. That's not a Republican thing. That's not a Democratic thing. That's an American thing. So what do we do about it, to answer Kurt's question? I don't have an answer what to do about it on the Republican side, aside from people like Dan and I, Kurt and Randy and folks who are far more influential than me in Republican circles, and talk about the need to address this issue. Start rolling out aggressively, these are the kind of proposals Republicans should address. But it's hard, because once someone becomes the candidate of a party, and particularly a two-party system, that's a powerful voice. And Trump, if he doesn't have a foreign policy, he's certainly animating some very unhelpful perceptions and outlooks in the American polity.
Sally, Leigh, are you concerned about the same phenomenon on the Democratic side?
No, because we have a candidate who is so tried and true in all of her policies. I mean, she's got a history. I think part of the Trump and the Sanders growth and development is that under the Bush administration, we fought 2 wars that we couldn't afford. It destroyed our economy. And President Obama came in thinking the people want us to get out of these wars and no longer conflict. And so that's what the president tried to do. I mean, that's what he was elected to do, and that's what he tried to do. So, I mean, I think that's why people aren't focusing on that. They're focusing on their own paychecks and the disparity in the wealth.
I think it's pretty incredible. I mean, 8 years later, George Bush. I think it's time that President Obama personally and Democrats who have worked for him and support him take responsibility for the world and the way that it looks. I mean, we have 8 different, 10 different, 12 different crises raging around the world. And I'm sorry, but George Bush has been gone for a while. And he's not to blame for what's happening right now.
It will take a generation to repair the damage that President Bush left us, at least a generation. So I understand that we continue to go back to that, but it is the context in which we are living in this world, and to ignore that is patently absurd. And there's something happening in the American citizenry that is rejecting conventional wisdom in Washington. I don't think anybody really knows what that is. There are trends across the world, and certainly in Europe, that this is happening as well. And I have to say that to dismiss Donald Trump as stupid or anything of the like is dangerous. The media didn't do it. The Republican Party establishment didn't do it. They did not address the concerns that are fundamentally, structurally in place right now in our electoral system that are causing the election of over 32 primaries for Donald Trump to secure the plurality needed to win.
Okay.
Unless you address the structural challenges in the party system, in the Republican Party in particular, Donald Trump is the first of several candidates coming like this.
Okay.
He is but a symptom.
Can we come to the gentleman here who's been persistent?
Thank you. My name is Jaakko Iloniemi. I'm a former Finnish ambassador to Washington. I think I would like to know whether the panelists would agree with me as I make the following observation. When Harold Macmillan was the foreign minister of Great Britain, he was asked by an interviewer, what are the foundations of your foreign policy? And he said, events, my boy, events. And now we know damned well that whatever your programs are, there are things like 9/11. There are things like the occupation of the Crimea. In other words, you may have the finest of foreign policy plans, but the decisive thing is, how do you react when something unexpected happens? And that comes down to character, much more than to plans. And therefore, the capacity of the president to come to grips with new developments, unexpected developments, to act wisely and moderately is much more important than what kind of length his platform has.
So reacting to events requires having the right character. Do we need to go to the panelists on this?
It's not just character, it's judgment, and it's reasonable thinking. And it's having somebody who has lived long enough and have had tough experiences and worked through them and learned. And that could be back to your character, but it's judgment.
Well, I think I agree with that. And again, I think going back to 2008 and the election of Obama, he clearly didn't have any of that. Thinking about the criteria, I mean, experience, age, having gone through this and that, he didn't have that. And I think it does explain his inability to successfully guide our country with respect to how we engage with the rest of the world.
Does it mean anything when Donald Trump uses the word win? That he has a lot of things that he says, but one of the things he says consistently is we have to win. You don't hear that a lot from anybody else. Is that a character trait when a crisis arises?
So I do have something to say about this because I think it speaks to his strategic communications abilities. I mean, this man is a celebrity. He's not a serious presidential candidate. He's completely unqualified to be president. But he is a celebrity, and he's been very, very successful in that, and especially on television, okay? And for some reason, Americans watched him and Celebrity Apprentice, for years, and before that, in other media vehicles, whatever. He knows how to manipulate the press. The press totally fell for it. And, his whole sort of iteration of that when he took it to the American people outside of, mainstream media channels was this slogan of America doesn't win anymore. We need to win again, which is a brilliant point that speaks to and can be adapted to whatever aspiration the person receiving that hears. So however you think we're losing in America, whether it's your own personal situation or something your cousin told you, or you just lost your job, or something you're reading in the headlines about the state of the world, you can apply that. It's a very strategic proxy for whatever the emotional subtext is of what the voter, are feeling. And it's a very, very powerful slogan, but it's a slogan.
Right, and you're saying it's only a slogan.
To add to that, when you think of Make America Great Again, why does that resonate? Because a vast majority of Americans, a vast majority, but close to a majority, if not more, feel that the system hasn't served them. We're now in a generation where many Americans won't live as well as their parents, or their kids won't live as well as they are. Another poll, I think I saw it in The Economist, said that 2/3 of Americans think the system is rigged against them. 2/3. Real income, real median income in the United States, and this is particularly hard hitting for the middle class, lower middle class and below, has been declining. People are frustrated. Make America Great Again, win, is something they haven't gotten out of Washington. They feel the world has become more unsafe. They feel that their economic futures are more uncertain. I can just speak for the Republican Party, but I bet you, maybe not as equally disturbing numbers, but trends are probably similar. I saw in a paper that they had a recent Acela primary. This was in New England states. Of Republican voters who participated in one of those states, 67% of voters felt the Republican Party leadership had betrayed them. It was 60% for another one. It was ranging between the high 50s and 67%. I would argue the Bernie Sanders movement is reflecting similar dynamics, perhaps not as extreme, but in the Democratic Party.
Konstantin.
I have two questions, one to this Democratic side of the panel, another one to the Republican one. To Leigh and Sally, the question is about specifically the future Clinton-Russia policy. Could you just give us a few bullet points about how it will be distinct? Because I'd say that a lot of people in Moscow, including most of my friends, are extremely disappointed with especially the last 4 years of the Kerry-Obama attitude to Russia. So will it be different from the last 4 years, well, these 4 years, and to what extent and where? And the question to Daniel and to Ian, you mentioned that, I think you mentioned, Ian, that Trump thinks that he can make a deal, he can make deals because he's a great deal maker. My experience both in the corporate sector and politics tells me that these are two very different occupations, and this conviction that you can make deals, if you're a good businessman, that you can do deals in politics, is, I think, plainly wrong, because two occupations are motivated by two different emotions. So to what extent you think that could lead to major disasters or major mistakes, let's put it like that, in the execution of the Republican foreign policy, especially?
Okay, good. We had the Russia question on your side already. Do you have anything you want to add, or? Okay, so let's go to Dan and Ian just on that. Will the businessman's temptation to cut deals lead to problems?
Well, I think it does. As probably many of you, for entertainment purposes, I like to follow Donald Trump on Twitter, and he had a tweet and he said, Hillary Clinton, she can't close a deal with Bernie. How is she going to close a deal with China and ISIS? And I thought to myself, yeah, because that's how it works. You sit across from the table from ISIS and you negotiate a solution to Iraq and Syria. And so I think you're absolutely right, Konstantin. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know. I mean, I think he's showing an incredible level of ignorance. And it's a little scary, quite frankly, if he actually believes what he's saying.
Okay. We have a question here in the middle.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Trivimi Velist, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in the days of Lennart Meri. And my question is about Mr. Trump, about his behavioral pattern. To what extent it is possible, probable, or realistic that as soon as he's in the White House, he would decisively change his rhetoric and his policy would be much more balanced, much more pro-NATO, and much less isolationist. And the second half of my question, if he fails to do that, and if he continues the same rhetoric in the White House, is it possible that the Congress would start a process of impeachment? Would there be enough? Would there be enough ground? Would there be enough legal ground for impeachment if the Congress is rather unanimous that the White House policy is not in the best interest of the United States?
Okay. Will he change or will he be impeached?
I think impeachment is unlikely because my prediction is that the Republican Party as a whole will in a lukewarm fashion fall behind him. So it's unlikely that the party that's just nominated and supports the election of their candidate moves immediately to impeach him. Regarding his ability to change, trying to be optimistic and doing my best to irritate my Democratic colleagues, there is a possibility that he'll moderate. He'll become more educated. He'll become more sophisticated in his intellect, in his worldview. As the election goes on, as he builds up, hopefully, a more competent foreign policy team. But that's kind of a little bit like rolling the dice.
Yeah. Sally, do you want to?
It's like rolling the dice is right. This is the presidency of the United States, and hope is not a strategy. We cannot risk that he might become more enlightened. This is a man who's demonstrated that he can lie repeatedly. He changes his mind. He's narcissistic. He's a bully. I have a son who's 23. He acts like my son did when he was 12. And we can't risk the presidency and hope. And I think the real answer is nobody knows.
Okay, we have General Clark here.
Thank you, Kurt. So we've always subscribed to the myth of a largely bipartisan foreign policy. And so my question is this. What percentage of Republican foreign policy practitioners, men like you two on the stage, do you think would be prepared to desert the Republican nominee in the aftermath, considering that, you know, my expectation is a lot of the office holders will get on the bandwagon, as you said, Daniel, and they'll be with him. So you know he doesn't have, thus far, a demonstrated capacity for the kind of prodigious workload that being the president actually requires. He has the bully pulpit potential of a Theodore Roosevelt, but without the work energy of a Roosevelt. So would the bipartisan, would you all be prepared to support the Democratic nominee? And conversely, for the Democrats on the stage, if Trump were to be elected, would you be prepared to support the Republican president in an effort to bring greater rationality and greater bipartisanship to American foreign policy?
Right now, I think that's an excellent question, General Clark, and something that we're all kind of watching and trying to figure out at this point. There's as you can imagine, there's quite a split among GOP national security hands. I'd say the majority are still not willing to work with Trump, and at least publicly aren't willing to state that they are. My sense is that that will change over time, and that, you know, we will get to a point where a majority of them are willing to work for Donald Trump, especially if he actually wins. I mean, look, then it becomes a reality, right? And I've gone back and forth on this so many times. I've signed letters, I've written op-eds, I've probably sent some regretful tweets. I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to work for him. I think there's going to be a genuinely conservative third-party alternative, and I look forward to possibly working for that individual and helping him or her. But I'm not going to work for Donald Trump. Based on what he's already said, I think he's done lasting damage to our image, the image of our country, and our credibility. At the same time, I will accept people, GOP hands, national security hands, working for him if we face the reality of a Trump presidency. At that point, it is in everyone's interest. If you're an American, if you're a European, whatever, it's in everyone's interest to have people surround Donald Trump who actually care about things like the transatlantic relationship, who are smart and who are competent, and who think in a way about foreign policy that is consistent with American tradition and values.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, yeah, go ahead.
I just would say, I don't want to answer the question right now because I don't want anybody who has any credibility to go behind him to help him get credibility, any reputational capital. Having said that, I'm an American first, and I'm going to help whatever president we have. But I'm really going to hope that it's a president who is worthy of it, who understands it, who has judgment, who's smart, who's tried and true, and is not a risk.
Okay, right here in the front row.
Charles Hillis, Pasternak, Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Quick question. We touched about what Congress could do. My question is more about institutions, civil servants, DOD, State, Department of Justice. Do you think they could kind of do slow things down if they saw there were Trump policies that they didn't quite appreciate?
The rebellion of the bureaucracy, is that going to happen? Sally, that most of them are Democrats.
Low blow. You know, they're civil servants, public servants. You know, I think if things get really bad, there's a lot of mechanisms, and I think people are going to get very creative because we don't want to see this become a disaster. So I think you're going to see a lot of creativity, and that may be one of them.
I have great trust and admiration for our civil servants, for our military. And they're going to do what the new administration asked them to do, except if it's illegal or fundamentally immoral. But, that's what I would expect of them.
Okay. Mr. President.
Well, there's just, you said it'll take 20 years to undo what George Bush did. One of the things that we're, of course, concerned about is that in our 12th year in NATO, when you look at the statements of Mr. Trump, and you look at the statements of Mr. Sanders, one wants to, the latter wants to bring Russia into NATO, which I remember them saying about sometime before the Munich Security Council conference, and the other one thinks it's out of date and obsolete. So my question, just pure out of national interest and not wanting to interfere in anyone's internal affairs, what is, in either case, will happen to NATO? I don't have doubts about Mrs. Clinton. I've known her since 1995. She's a firm transatlanticist, but the other two options, what happens?
Well, someone said earlier that Trump's committed to holding a NATO summit. Maybe that's in order to disband it. I don't know. I hope not. I hope not. But look, if there's still this outstanding question of how serious is this guy about anything he says. I think that there's, again, from my perspective, the man has a worldview going back decades to the 1980s. There are very strong isolationist components. He took out an ad in 1987, paid $100,000 in the New York Times to take out an ad asking Americans, why is it that we subsidize our allies in terms of defense and security? It's not a good deal for the United States. So this isn't some notion that he whipped up after looking at a Pew Research poll and saying, hey, you know, I think Americans' trust in NATO is dipping a little bit. I think NATO's popularity is dipping a little bit. Why don't I say that NATO's obsolete? It's not that. He's not posturing. He actually believes these things. And so I think, you know, speaking to an audience like this, I think we all collectively need to prepare for the potential of some sort of fundamental transformation under a Donald Trump presidency. I hope that people in the civil service, I hope, you know, folks like me who are going to remain on the outside and make use of all the mechanisms that we have, you know, both in reality and theoretically at our disposal to guide him in a more rational direction, and one that's more consistent with American tradition and American values. But again, he's got a worldview. It goes back decades, and especially this notion that our allies are extracting too much money, too many resources from us, and it doesn't make sense in terms of U.S. national interest.
Okay, and I'm not asking you to speak for Bernie Sanders, but to interpret Bernie Sanders. What do you think about his comments?
Well, I think that Senator Sanders is, I think it's a hypothetical, to be honest with you. And I think he is, I actually think he is more towards the isolationist wing of the Democratic Party than is being discussed, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it's a hangover from a different era. I do reject the categorization of Donald Trump being an isolationist, though, because deploying nuclear weapons to solve your ISIL problem is not an isolationist policy.
Okay, we had one here in the middle. And then we're going to start to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Javed Ludin from Afghanistan. I'll give it a little bit of a different perspective from where I come, to the extent that this panel was very entertaining. I tell you that the real show was much more, has really been much more entertaining in the last 1 year for everyone. And it's especially one that's perplexing as well. The American elections is not just for the American people. And the one thing I like about the American people is that they're so simple, they're so straightforward. They think that the way they talk about their politics and their elections and their presidents and everything, that everyone in the world understands it. They obviously do a lot of it, but there is so much that we don't understand. I have lived in the West, so I understand it perfectly well. But a lot of the challenge that the US faces in that part of the world comes from communication, from lack of understanding. This is really the way, people in my part of the world look at this and say, a country that elected 8 years ago a black president for the first time, that was absolutely massive, made history and made people cry. Now, in these elections, it's a real circus. It's Donald Trump, and then on the other side is Bernie Sanders, a socialist, and whatever the Trump is. Now, whoever becomes the president, I think the absolute essential task would be to reassure people that what really America stands for, what is the enduring aspect of America, not this, the jingling aspect of America. The enduring aspect, there has to be consistency in foreign policy, and whatever the changes, it has to be an essential part of the American foreign policy, is to have a bit of a reassurance to people that what really is the enduring aspect of foreign policy.
Thank you. That's a great segue to the wrap-up round then. So let's go right to that. Just in 1 minute, just a clear thought. What do you think is the most important thing for the next president to do in foreign policy upon assuming office? Leigh.
I knew you were going to start with me first. Two very simple answers. I hope the next president, regardless of party, meets with congressional leadership in a bipartisan fashion. I honestly, and commits to regular meetings with congressional leadership. And the second thing is outreach to important allies, especially in Europe. We cannot do anything in the world without that kind of relationship being as strong as it has been under this administration and stronger.
Meeting with Congress, meeting with allies. Sally?
I think the transatlantic relationship, and to make it robust and immediately try to work more with our allies on the biggest issues, because I think we can solve them.
Dan?
I think the next American president needs to restore American credibility and restore our ruptured relationships with our allies. Over the last 8 years, I mean, we've had an administration that has drawn red lines in Syria, allowed them to be crossed with impunity. We've had an administration that's gone out of its way to conduct outreach to authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin. And again, in my view, we've had an administration that reached a very questionable Iran deal over the heads of our closest allies and partners in the Middle East. And so the next American president and the next administration will have to overcome this legacy, restore American credibility, restore the trust that our allies used to have in us, and restore the fear that our adversaries also used to have in us.
So different attitude, but same as Sally, transatlantic relationship and allies.
I think it's collective. It can't be about a single region. It can't just be about the pivot to Asia. It can't be about the pivot back to Europe. It has to be about American credibility. We have to restore American credibility both with our friends and our adversaries alike.
Okay, and Ian.
You know, I'm a complete hypocrite because I'm going, after bashing Trump, I'm going to take his recommendation and say he ought to hold a NATO summit. He ought to visit, do what he said. That's what the next president should do. Why? Because going to Europe is going to the heart of the community of democracies that's separate and critical to our stature in the world. To do what Dan and my colleagues have said is to kind of reaffirm American commitment to that community of democracies, reaffirm American leadership in that community of democracies is probably the most important thing that a new president can do, particularly in the context, I would say, let's say, just particularly in the context of this ongoing election.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. For those of you who stuck with us, thank you as well for staying for our debate. Thanks to our debaters, Leigh O'Neill, Sally Painter, Dan Vajdich, and Brzezinski. Thank you.